Hi, welcome back to my channel. Apologies, it's been quite a while since I put out a video, but I'm back and I'm excited to share my latest display update. Thanks to the recent reissue of their Insecticons by Fanstoys, I was finally able to fill a big hole in my collection. A really nice set, and personally I think it's the best version of these characters out there, so I'm really glad I held out. For me, even though these guys were technically Decepticons, I always considered them their own group and their own faction because they were really only loyal to themselves. So when it came to brainstorming ideas on what to do with this display, I wanted to create something that was cohesive enough where it would match and go with the rest of my other Decepticon displays, yet it was separate enough and distinct enough that it was kind of its own thing. And then I recalled in the original G1 cartoon, when they were first introduced in that episode, they appeared in the swamp. And so I thought, it would be really cool to kind of recreate that look. And so for this project, I decided to start with my standard bases, but then give it a mossy, swampy effect to it. And this just gave me another opportunity to try something new, work with new materials, and just challenge myself creatively. So stay tuned as I show you how I went about creating these. For this project, I'm using my go-to material, this installation foam or XPS foam. And starting off, I went ahead and glued a couple sheets of this material together. This way I can build some height and some thickness. For these bases, I wanted to give them all a bit of a slant so everything looked a little off-kiltered. Not only would it make the bases more visually interesting, I thought that this would kind of enhance the whole swamp theme. Because I was imagining that these structures were kind of embedded in the water and we were just seeing the portions that were just kind of peeking out from the tops of the water. And to achieve this, I needed to make a couple of initial cuts at the bottom of each base using my hot wire table. And I wanted to make sure that these cuts were as perfect and as clean as possible. This way, not only would it meant that the bases would be stable and wouldn't be wobbly, it also meant that I wouldn't have to follow up and do as much sanding afterwards to ensure that the surface was perfectly flat. And the hot wire table is a really good tool for that. At this stage, like most of my other projects, I like to let my imagination and creativity guide me in the direction I want to go and with the cuts I'm making. The only thing I'm really keeping in mind at this point are the relative height of each piece and how they relate to one another. Since the figures I plan on placing on these are all pretty much the same height, any variation would have to come from the bases themselves. Since these are essentially acting as risers, part of the trick was to strike a balance between function and aesthetic. The cuts I'm making are pretty rough, which is okay. Obviously, I'm trying to be as precise and steady as possible, but at this stage, it's really not that important. Main thing here is getting the general shape nailed down, because I know I can always go back later and actually do the cleanup in the next step. For these bases, the plan is to incorporate some rock along with the metallic structures. So at this stage, I'm more or less plotting out where the boundaries are. Again, main goal at this stage is just to block in the general shapes and then refine later. And at some point during this process, I went ahead and placed my pieces into the DTOF itself, just so I can kind of test fit and see how everything would kind of fit all together in the shelf itself. And just from looking at it, I could tell I needed to trim a little more, so everything was a little smaller and not so cramped. And after making all my initial cuts with my hot wire table, and I'm overall pretty happy with the direction and the overall shape of my pieces, I can now move on to my utility knife and my files, and these I will use to help define and smooth out all the surfaces. One thing I really like about working with this foam is just how easy it is to shape and carve with just a couple of simple tools. It's messy for sure, so I definitely recommend wearing a mask or respirator so you aren't breathing in all the dust. But just with a couple of simple passes with your sandpaper or your file, and you'll be pretty surprised at just how quickly you can start to shape and refine all the surfaces. And one thing I am cognizant of at this point is making sure I'm adding slight variations to the height of the top surface of each base. These kind of high and low points actually serve two purposes. One is that it actually adds interest and makes the overall surface look interesting, but it also helps to prevent the figures themselves from sliding off. Because you actually notice that when you actually place a figure on these bases, especially in this case where there's a slant to it, their feet will actually catch on some of these raised edges, and that will kind of help them from sliding off. For this project, I'm trying out this set of leather punch tools that I recently bought. These are metal stencils that come in various sizes and shapes. The edges are relatively sharp, which I'm hoping will allow you to cut and engrave marks in the foam. And these work just okay. The circle stencils work really well because you are able to turn the stencil itself and actually cut the surface and cut the foam. For the other shapes where you can't, you have to be really careful not to press down too hard initially, or you just end up smashing and tearing the foam instead. What you really need to do is just apply a little bit of pressure initially, give it a good imprint, and then follow up with a knife to cut the foam. And to add the final details like these panel lines, I first score the foam with my knife. I generally just do this freehand, which isn't difficult as long as you have steady hands. And after I make the initial cuts, I go back over them again with something a little duller, something like a pencil. This helps redefine the lines and just help enlarge the actual grooves, which help them stand out better. And for the final touches, I wanted to add some weathering to the surface. Because these bases are set in a swamp, I wanted to make sure that there were plenty of nicks and scratches throughout the surface. And I also imagined that these Insecticons would actually be gnawing on the surface as well. So I wanted to go a little more overboard on these with the damage. So I'm taking out large chunks of material, almost as if bites were literally taken out of the surface. And the process is pretty much the same for all three pieces, just a lot of sanding and cutting. At this stage, I'm pretty happy with how these turned out. Just one last thing is to just add a little spackle along the seams just to hide them a little better. And with that, I can now move on to paint. To prime the surface, I'm using some dark brown paint. For all my projects, I mainly use latex house paint I pick up in sample sizes at my local hardware store. I like using this paint because it covers really well, and it also acts as a sealer, so I don't need to actually seal the surface of the foam before I actually apply color. And in general, it only takes one good coat to really cover the surface. With a second one, just for touch-ups and anything I might have missed. At this point, I remembered I needed to add some weight to one of the bases. Because one of them was tall and narrow, it needed some weight at the bottom to make it bottom heavy, so it wouldn't tip over, especially when I plan to set a figure on top of it. To do this, I first roughly cut out a square out of some scrap piece of foam I had. Then I used that as a stencil to give me the size of the opening I plan to dig out. Then it's just simply about removing the material using my knife or whatever else that worked. Once I had a decent sized hole, I went ahead and filled it with some gravel, which provided the weight, and then I went and sealed it back up with some hot glue. And once I put the lid back on, I want to make sure that it's flat as possible, so that when I flip the base right side up, that it'll actually sit flat. With that done and my primer nice and dry, I can now paint my top layers. For these bases, I decided to go with 2 different shades of purple for the metallic surfaces. So as I'm applying the first color, I'm arbitrarily picking out which ones I want to be which color. And once the first color is laid down and dry, I can then go back and add the second color. And for this part, again, it only took 1 good coat of paint, with just a second one for touch-ups here and there. Next, I added some panel lining with a black brush pen, going over all the thin lines I had previously made. And the point of this is to redefine the lines again that may have gotten lost when I painted the surface with the purple. And with the purple done, I can turn my attention to the rocks. Here I am dry brushing a light brown over the top of my primer, making sure I'm just hitting the raised areas mainly. The key here to making these rocks look realistic is to make sure that you have as little paint as possible on your brush, and also when you're actually brushing to apply it with very light, gentle pressure. And once that's done, all that's left is to do some weathering and some finishing touches. And for the weathering, I first apply a thin wash of black-brown paint all over the surface, and I then go back and wipe the majority of it away with a paper towel, leaving just bits here and there to give it some grime. And then to finish off, I add some silver paint just to certain spots. And this is to bring out some highlights and edges and to help accentuate the whole metallic look of it. And normally this is where I would finish off my typical bases, but for this we still need to actually add the swampy effect. Going into this project, I knew recreating that mossy look was going to be the biggest challenge for me. Being that this is new, there's always that uncertainty of something not turning out exactly right. It really sucks in this scenario since you already put in all this work to get to this point. So when it came to this part, I had to do some research and ask around for some advice. And that's when someone suggested using dryer lint of all things to replicate the mossy effect. And so I thought I'd just give it a shot. So to start out, I mixed some paint together to give me a good green base color. Then I added some PVA glue, and finally followed by some dryer lint. And once I thought this concoction was thoroughly mixed, I just went ahead and applied it to the base. And this was definitely a messy step, but basically you place the pieces of lint wherever you wanted the moss to be, and then kind of just moved it around a bit until you got it exactly the way you want it. And then you just dab up any excess moisture with some paper towel. And at first I used a palette knife to apply each piece, but later I just resorted to using my fingers, which was simpler, albeit messier. And when it dried, I was relieved that the glue I added really helped everything bind and stick to the surface. And the only thing left to do after that was to just go back and follow up with some lighter green here and there to bring back some of the color and just make it a little brighter. All in all, I'm pretty happy with the results, and I can see myself using this method again. And the plan is to do just that because I wanted to create a small background to go along with this display as well. But for now, these guys are looking pretty good, and I'm really happy with the display I created for them. And hopefully once I have the background done, I'll put up another update, so stay tuned. Until then, thank you for watching. Please comment, like, and subscribe for more content. Till next time.